My name is Beverly Faison. I'm 27 years old, and I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. At my father's retirement party, my mother stood in front of 120 guests and announced that the greatest gift my husband and I could give my father was to stay away. She said Marcus, my husband of 5 years, would embarrass the family because he works in a kitchen. She said his hands smell like grease and sweat, and that he had no place among accomplished people. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because what my mother didn't know, what my father, the most respected food critic in New Orleans, didn't know, was that for the past year, every time he sat down at his favorite restaurant and ordered the dish he called transcendent, the dish he said was worth the drive alone, Marcus was in the kitchen, making it. With those same hands my mother called too dirty to shake. And when my father found out, everything shattered. People think line cooks just follow recipes. They don't understand that sauce making is alchemy. You can't fake it. You can't rush it. Marcus would spend 11 hours making a beurre blanc that diners would finish in 3 bites, and he never once said it wasn't worth it. He wakes up at 4:30 every morning. The alarm goes off in the dark and I feel him slip out of bed, careful not to wake me even though I'm always awake. I hear the shower run. I smell the coffee he makes. Black, no sugar, strong enough to strip paint. By 5:15, he's gone. He comes home at 11:15 at night, sometimes later. 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. He makes $52,000 a year as a lead saucier at Maison Vermilion, a James Beard-nominated restaurant in the French Quarter. It's not a lot of money, not in a city where rent keeps climbing and everything costs more than it should, but Marcus never complains. He loves what he does. He loves it the way some people love their children, with this fierce, protective devotion that doesn't need to be explained. When he comes home at night, he smells like thyme and butter and something darker, earthier. Rue, maybe, or the cast iron pans he uses to build flavor in layers. His hands are always clean by the time he gets home. He scrubs them raw every night before he leaves the kitchen. But if you look closely, you can see the calluses on his palms from holding knives, the burn scar on his left thumb from a roux pot that splashed, the way his fingers curve slightly inward from years of gripping handles. My father never asked what Marcus did for a living. He just assumed it wasn't worth asking about. My father, Raymond DuPont, is a legend in New Orleans. At least, that's what people call him. He's been a food critic for 30 years. He writes for New Orleans Magazine, and before that, he wrote for the Times Picayune. He has a column. He has a following. When my father writes a review, restaurants live or die by it. In 30 years, he's written over 2,400 reviews. 87 restaurants closed after he gave them 1 or 2 stars. 43 restaurants became institutions after he gave them 4 or 5. People trust him. Chefs fear him. And my father, he loves that. He loves the power of it. The way people lean in when he talks about food, like he's revealing secrets from another world. He talks about having a refined palate. He talks about recognizing excellence. He talks about food the way other people talk about art or religion, with this reverence that borders on obsession. But here's what most people don't know. My father grew up poor. His father, my grandfather, was a line cook at a diner on Magazine Street. He worked there for 40 years. He died of a heart attack in that kitchen when he was 62, and my father was 23. My father told me once, when I was 16, that he swore he'd never end up like his own father. He said, "My father worked himself to death in a kitchen and died with nothing. I swore I'd never let that happen to me. I write about food. I don't make it." There's a difference, Beverly. One requires a mind. The other just requires hands. I remember that conversation. I remember the way he said hands, like it was something dirty. like manual labor was beneath him. So when I brought Marcus home in 2019 and said, "Dad, this is my fiancé. He's a cook." I watched my father's face turn to stone. He stared at Marcus for 8 seconds. I counted. Then he stood up and walked out of the room. He didn't say a word. He just left. My mother, Claire, looked at me and said, "Beverly, you can't do this to this family." I said, "Do what? Fall in love?" She said, "You know what I mean." We got married anyway. It was a small wedding. 60 people. My father showed up because my mother made him. He stood at the back of the church during the ceremony. He didn't walk me down the aisle. I walked myself. He didn't give a toast. And when Marcus held out his hand to shake at the reception, my father looked at it for 3 seconds and then turned and walked away. 45 minutes later, my father left the wedding. My mother stayed another hour, but she didn't speak to me. She didn't hug me. She just stood by the bar, drinking white wine and looking like she was at a funeral. That was 5 years ago. In those 5 years, my parents and I have had 0 family dinners, 0 phone calls where we talked about anything real. Christmas in 2022, my mother called and said, "If you bring him, your father will leave." Is that what you want? To ruin Christmas for everyone because you chose a man who smells like a deep fryer? I hung up. Marcus and I spent Christmas alone that year. We made jambalaya and watched old movies and pretended it didn't hurt. But here's the thing my parents didn't know. While they were icing us out, Marcus was building something extraordinary. Something that would end up in my father's mouth. In October of 2023, my father published a review of Maison Vermilion. I was at work when it went live. I opened the New Orleans Magazine website on my phone during my lunch break, and I saw the headline, Maison Vermilion, the gold standard of Creole cuisine, by Raymond Dupont. 5 out of 5 stars. My father almost never gives 5 stars. I scrolled down, reading, and then I got to the part about the étouffée. He wrote, "I have eaten étouffée at every restaurant in this city worth mentioning, from Commander's Palace to the humblest corner cafe. I have eaten it in Breaux Bridge, in Lafayette, in kitchens where grandmothers guard recipes like state secrets. But I have never, and I mean never, tasted an étouffée like this. The sauce is transcendent. The roux is dark as mahogany but carries no bitterness. The shrimp, Gulf, obviously, and fresh, release their sweetness slowly like a secret being whispered. And underneath it all is a depth I cannot name. It's earthy. It's almost smoky? No. It's darker than that. It's the taste of something loved. This is not cooking. This is alchemy. The saucier here is a master. And I would drive 2 hours in traffic just to taste this dish again. If I could only eat one meal for the rest of my life, it would be this." My hands were shaking when I finished reading. I knew Marcus worked at Maison Vermilion. He'd been there since June of 2021, but I didn't know he made that dish. Marcus worked the sauce station, but I thought he made other things. Stocks, reductions, the beurre blancs, and the demi-glaces. I didn't know he made the étouffée. I called him. He was at work, in the middle of lunch service, but he picked up. I said, "Babe, are you busy?" He said, "A little. What's up?" I said, "Dad just reviewed your restaurant." There was a pause. 3 seconds. Then he said, "Yeah, I saw." I said, "He said the étouffée is the best thing he's ever had. Do you make that?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then Marcus said, "No, that's Chef Antoine's dish. I just work the grill station." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Marcus had never lied to me before. I said, "Okay. Well, that's good. At least Dad's praising the restaurant where you work." Marcus said, "Yeah, I guess so." We hung up. I went back to work, and I didn't think about it again. But 3 weeks later, I was at my parents' house. My mother had called and asked me to stop by to pick up some old photo albums she'd found in the attic. I went alone. Marcus was working. My father wasn't home. It was just my mother and me, and the conversation was strained and awkward, the way it always was now. As I was leaving, I passed my father's office. The door was open, and on the wall, in a black frame, was the review. The Maison Vermilion review. He'd had it printed and framed and hung on the wall like a diploma. I stared at it. At the 5-star rating. At the paragraph about the étouffée. At the word transcendent. And something in my chest twisted. I didn't know why. I just knew that something about it felt wrong. Marcus didn't start working at Maison Vermilion until June of 2021. Before that, he worked at a place called Bayou Kitchen, a small Creole restaurant in Mid-City. It wasn't fancy. The dining room had 20 tables, and the kitchen was the size of a closet. But the owner, a man named Jean, gave Marcus freedom. Jean said, "You want to experiment? Do it during family meal." Family meal is what kitchen staff eat before service starts. It's usually scraps, leftovers, whatever needs to be used up. But Marcus started using it as a lab. He'd make dishes he'd been thinking about. Dishes he wanted to perfect. In 2019, Marcus became obsessed with étouffée. His grandmother had made it when he was a kid. She died in 2018 and she never wrote down her recipe. She cooked by feel, by instinct, by some kind of magic Marcus couldn't name. After she died, Marcus tried to recreate it. He wanted to taste it again. He wanted to remember her. For 2 years, he tried. He made 69 different versions of that sauce. 69. Versions 1 through 15 were too salty. Versions 16 through 30, the roux was too dark. It tasted burnt, acrid. Versions 31 through 50 were close, but they lacked depth. They tasted flat. Versions 51 through 68 were good. Really good. But they weren't perfect. Version 69 was perfect. The secret, Marcus told me this later, was coffee. 1/4 teaspoon of Café du Monde coffee grounds stirred into the roux. You couldn't taste the coffee, but it added this deep, earthy undertone that made the sauce taste like it had been cooking for days. And he added 2 drops of fish sauce, a trick he learned from a Vietnamese line cook he worked with. And he toasted the shrimp shells for exactly 45 minutes. Not 30, not 60, 45. In March of 2021, Marcus made version 69 at home for me. I took 1 bite and I started crying. I said, "Baby, I don't know how to describe this. It tastes like home." Marcus smiled. He said, "That's what it's supposed to taste like." In April of 2021, a man walked into Bayou Kitchen and ordered the étouffée. His name was Antoine Rousseau. He was the head chef at Maison Vermilion. He'd been driving through Mid-City and he was hungry, and he saw Bayou Kitchen and he stopped. He didn't expect much. It was just a Tuesday lunch. But when he tasted the étouffée, he stopped chewing. He put his fork down. He closed his eyes. Then he called the manager over and said, "Who made this?" The manager said, "Marcus, our line cook." Antoine said, "I need to meet him." Marcus came out of the kitchen, still wearing his apron, his hands smelling like shrimp and butter. Antoine stood up and shook his hand and said, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Marcus said, "I didn't go to culinary school. I just taught myself." Antoine said, "Bullshit. Nobody teaches themselves to make a sauce like this." Marcus said, "I made it 69 times over 2 years." Antoine stared at him. Then he said, "Do you want to work for me?" Antoine offered Marcus $52,000 a year. That was more than double what he was making at Bayou Kitchen. The position was lead saucier at Maison Vermilion, one of the most respected restaurants in New Orleans. James Beard nominated 3 years running. A AA4 Diamond rated. Marcus said yes. He started on June 1st, 2021. I was so proud of him. I wanted to tell my parents. I said, "Baby, we have to tell them. Maison Vermilion is Dad's favorite restaurant. Maybe this will change things." But Marcus said, "No, don't." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because if you tell them, they'll think I'm trying to prove something. They'll think I'm trying to get into your father's world through the back door, and they'll resent me even more." I didn't understand it then, but I let it go. In August of 2021, Marcus's étouffée went on the menu at Maison Vermilion. It was listed as Maison Vermilion Signature Étouffée, $38. Marcus's name wasn't on the menu. That's standard in fine dining. The head chef gets the credit. The line cooks stay invisible. For 2 years, Marcus made that sauce every single day. He woke up at 4:30 in the morning and got to the restaurant by 5:15. He started prepping the roux at 5:30. It took 4 hours to make a batch. Slow, careful stirring over medium heat, watching the color shift from blonde to peanut butter to mahogany. If you rushed it, it burned. If you didn't stir constantly, it seized. Marcus made 40 to 60 portions a day, depending on reservations. And for 2 years, my father had no idea. On October 15th, 2023, my father's review went live. Marcus read it at work, during a break between lunch and dinner service. He stood in the walk-in cooler, staring at his phone, reading the words transcendent and alchemy and the best thing I've ever tasted. And he didn't tell me. He came home that night at 11:30. I was awake, reading in bed. He sat down on the edge of the mattress and he said, "Your dad reviewed the restaurant today." I said, "I know. I read it. He loved the étouffée." Marcus nodded. He didn't say anything. I said, "You don't make that, do you?" He said, "No. That's Antoine's thing." And I believed him. In December of 2023, my father went back to Maison Vermilion. It was his and my mother's 35th wedding anniversary. He made a reservation for 2. He ordered the étouffée. Marcus saw him walk in. He was standing at the sauce station and he looked through the kitchen window into the dining room, and there was my father, sitting at table 12 with my mother, holding the menu. Marcus's hands started shaking. The sous chef noticed. He said, "You good, man?" Marcus said, "Yeah, that's my father-in-law out there." The sous chef said, "The critic? Shit. No pressure, huh?" Marcus said, "He doesn't know it's me." When the order came in, étouffée for table 12, Marcus made it himself. He took an extra 2 minutes with the roux, making sure the color was perfect. He tasted it 3 times before he plated it. His hands were shaking so badly that he almost dropped the bowl. He passed it to the expediter. The expediter passed it to the server. The server brought it to my father. My father took 1 bite, then another. Then he put his fork down and said to my mother, "This is even better than last time." My mother said, "You say that every time." My father said, "Because it's true every time." Marcus heard it. He was standing near the kitchen door, listening, and when he came home that night, he sat on the bed and he said, "Your dad came in tonight." I said, "Did he see you?" Marcus said, "No, he never does." Between November of 2023 and September of 2024, my father went back to Maison Vermilion 6 times. Visit number 2 was the anniversary dinner in December. Visit number 3 was in February, a business dinner with his editor. Visit number 4 was in April. He brought my little brother, Luke. Luke is 23. He's a culinary student at the New Orleans Culinary Institute. He wants to be a chef. My father has always been supportive of Luke in ways he was never supportive of me. Luke is the golden child, the one who chose the right path. my father took Luc to Maison Vermilion to show him what a real Creole kitchen looks like. They sat at the counter, the seats that faced directly into the open kitchen. Luc was excited. He kept watching the line cooks, asking my father questions. Marcus was at the sauce station. He had his back turned, working on a beurre blanc, when the expediter called out, "Marcus, étouffé, table 7." Marcus turned around to grab the bowl, and Luc looked right at him. Luc squinted. He said, "That guy looks familiar." My father wasn't paying attention. He was reading the menu. He said, "Who?" Luc said, "The line cook. I think I've seen him somewhere." Marcus's heart stopped. He turned away, grabbed a container from the shelf, and said to the sous chef, "I need to grab something from the walk-in." He went into the walk-in cooler and stood there for 10 minutes. It was 38 degrees. He could see his breath. His hands were shaking. Outside, Luc kept staring at the kitchen, trying to place where he'd seen Marcus before. But he only saw Marcus for 2 seconds, and Marcus was wearing a chef's coat and a toque, and Luc wasn't sure. So he let it go. My father ordered the étouffée, but this time, Marcus didn't make it. The sous chef made it instead, because Marcus was hiding in the cooler. When my father tasted it, he said, "It's good, but it's different today." Luc said, "Different how?" My father said, "It's missing something. It doesn't have the same soul." Marcus heard that later when he came out of the cooler. The sous chef told him. And Marcus felt 2 things at once. Pride, because my father could taste the difference when it wasn't Marcus's hands making it, and terror, because he was running out of time. Eventually, my father would find out. Eventually, this secret would explode. In August of 2024, 3 weeks before my father's retirement party, Marcus tried to tell me. It was a Tuesday night. We were at home. I was working on a project for my job, something with a tight deadline. Marcus sat down next to me on the couch and said, "Babe, we need to talk." I said, "About what?" He said, "About your dad and the restaurant." I looked up from my laptop. I said, "What about it?" He opened his mouth. He was about to say it. I could see it in his face. The weight of the truth pressing down on him, ready to come out. And then my phone rang. It was my boss. An emergency. A file had been corrupted and I needed to fix it before 11 p.m. or we'd miss the deadline. I said, "Babe, I'm so sorry. Can we talk about this later?" Marcus hesitated. Then he said, "Yeah, it's fine. It's not that important." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah, go do your work." I went back to my laptop. Marcus sat there for another minute staring at the floor. Then he got up and went to the kitchen and made himself tea. Later, he told me what he was thinking in that moment. He was thinking, "I'll tell her after the party. After Raymond retires, when things calm down. I'll tell her then." He didn't know that in 23 days, the truth would walk into a ballroom and announce itself in front of 120 people. On September 28th, 2024, my father went to Maison Vermilion for the 6th and final time. It was a farewell dinner. He'd invited 8 colleagues, food critics, journalists, editors, to celebrate his retirement. He made a reservation for 9 people at 7 p.m. When the group arrived, my father insisted they all order the étouffée. He said, "You have to try this. It's the best Creole food in the city, maybe the best I've ever had." Marcus was in the kitchen. He heard the order come in. 9 étouffées for table 6. 9. He'd never made 9 portions at once before. The pressure was immense. He made a large batch. Enough for 10 portions, just in case. He tasted the sauce 5 times. He adjusted the seasoning 3 times. He plated each portion with precision. Exactly 8.5 ounces of sauce per plate. At the table, my father's colleagues tasted the étouffée and raved. One said, "Raymond, this is extraordinary." Another said, "The depth. How do they get this depth?" My father smiled like he'd made it himself. He said, "I told you. This is why I've been coming here for a year." Then he raised his glass and gave a toast. He said, "Gentlemen, in 30 years I've tasted thousands of dishes, but this," he pointed at the étouffée, "this is the one I'll remember. This is the standard. This is what we should all be chasing." Excellence like this doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone cares enough to make something perfect, even when no one's watching. Marcus was standing near the kitchen door. He could hear every word. His eyes were wet. The sous chef noticed. He said, "You good, man?" Marcus said, "He's talking about my sauce, and he doesn't even know." 2 weeks later, Marcus would stand in a ballroom and watch my father praise him to 120 people without knowing who he was praising, and the truth would finally, brutally, come out. In late August, my mother called me for the first time in 2 years. I was at work when my phone rang. I saw her name on the screen and I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. I said, "Hello?" She said, "Beverly, it's Mom." I said, "I know." There was a pause. Then she said, "Your father is retiring in October. We're having a party." I said, "Okay." She said, "It's on October 12th, at the Windsor Hotel, 6 p.m. I said, "Are Marcus and I invited?" She didn't answer right away. 4 seconds of silence. Then she said, "Beverly, you know how your father feels about your situation." She didn't say husband. She said, situation. Like Marcus was a problem I'd chosen instead of a person I loved. I said, "So we're not invited?" She said, "I didn't say that." I said, "Then what are you saying?" She said, "I'm saying it would be easier if Marcus didn't come." I felt something cold settle in my chest. I said, "Easier for who?" She said, "For your father. For the family. Beverly, there are going to be 120 people there. Food critics, chefs, the mayor, your father's colleagues. If Marcus is there, it will be awkward." I said, "Awkward for Dad, not awkward for me." She said, "Don't be difficult." I said, "I'm not being difficult. I'm asking if my husband is invited to my father's retirement party." She sighed. She said, "If you insist on bringing him, at least make sure he dresses appropriately. No kitchen clothes. No." I said, "No what, Mom?" She said, "You know what I mean. His hands. They smell like onions, like grease. Make sure he scrubs them." I hung up. I called my little brother, Luke, 10 minutes later. I said, "Did Mom really just uninvite Marcus to Dad's party?" Luke said, "She didn't uninvite him. She just said it would be better if he didn't come." I said, "That's the same thing, Luke." He said, "I know. I tried to talk to her. I told her Marcus works at Maison Vermilion. Dad loves that place. But Mom just said, that makes it worse." I said, "What does that even mean?" Luke said, "I don't know, Bev. I think she's worried people will ask what Marcus does, and when they find out he's a cook, it'll embarrass Dad." I said, "Embarrass him how?" Luke didn't answer. I said, "Who else is invited?" He said, 120 people, critics from all over the Gulf Coast. Some chefs. Antoine Rousseau from Maison Vermilion is coming. I said, "Antoine's coming?" Luke said, "Yeah. Dad invited him personally." I felt something twist in my chest again, but I didn't know why. I said, "Thanks for telling me, Luke." He said, "Are you going to come?" I said, "Yeah, we're coming. Both of us." I called my mother back that night. I said, "Marcus and I are coming to the party." She said, "Beverly, please don't do this. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I said, "I'm not making anything hard. I'm attending my father's retirement party with my husband. That's what daughters do." She said, "If you bring him, your father will ask you to leave. In front of everyone. Is that what you want? To humiliate him at his own party?" I said, "No, Mom. I want you to see what you've been missing for 5 years. And if Dad wants to humiliate himself by asking us to leave, that's his choice." She started to say something, but I hung up before she could finish. I didn't tell Marcus about that conversation. I just told him we were going to the party. When he asked, "Are you sure?" I kissed him and said, "I've never been more sure of anything." On October 12th, 2024, at 5:45 p.m., Marcus and I got dressed for my father's retirement party. Marcus wore a dark navy suit he'd borrowed from a friend, a white dress shirt, black shoes he'd polished that afternoon. He looked good. He looked nervous. I wore an emerald green dress and heels that made me 2 inches taller. I looked at myself in the mirror and I thought, I look like I belong there, even if they don't think I do. We drove to the Windsor Hotel in silence. Marcus's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I said, "We don't have to go." He said, "Yes, we do." We parked. We walked into the lobby. The grand ballroom was on the second floor. We took the elevator. The doors opened. We stepped out into the hallway. And I heard the noise, the hum of 120 people talking, laughing, drinking. I heard silverware clinking against plates. I heard my father's voice, loud and warm, greeting someone at the door. Marcus stopped walking. He said, "I don't know if I can do this." I took his hand. I said, "You don't have to prove anything to them. You just have to be yourself." He nodded. We walked down the hallway. We stepped into the ballroom, and every conversation stopped. The grand ballroom at the Windsor Hotel is beautiful. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, walls painted cream and gold. Round tables draped in white linen. A stage at the front with a microphone and a podium. 120 people were already there. Most of them I didn't recognize. Food critics, journalists, chefs in their formal whites. Some I did. Old family friends, my father's colleagues, my mother's book club. When Marcus and I walked in, people turned to look. Conversations stuttered. I saw heads lean together. I heard whispers. My mother was standing near the bar. She saw us and her face went pale. She walked over quickly, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She stopped 3 feet away and said, "You came." I said, "You invited me?" She looked at Marcus. She said, "Marcus, you look different." Marcus said, "Good different or bad different?" She didn't answer. She turned and walked away. My father was across the room, talking to a group of men in suits. He glanced over and saw us. Our eyes met. He held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked away and kept talking. He didn't come over. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge us at all. Marcus and I stood near the back of the room, by the tall windows that overlooked the street. For 32 minutes, no one came to talk to us except Luke. Luke walked over, smiling, and hugged me. He shook Marcus's hand and said, "I'm glad you guys came." Marcus said, "Thanks for the heads up about the guest list." Luke said, "Yeah, Mom told everyone you were too busy with work to make it. When people see you, they're going to know she lied." I said, "Good." Luke glanced over his shoulder. He said, "Mom's been watching you guys for the last 10 minutes. She looks like she's going to have a breakdown." I said, "That's her problem, not mine." Luke grinned. He said, "I love you, Bev." He walked away. Marcus and I stood there, alone again. Marcus whispered, "Do you want to leave?" I said, "No, we're staying." And then the lights dimmed. The slideshow started. A screen dropped down at the front of the room, 20 feet wide, 10 feet tall. The first photo appeared. My father, young, maybe 25, standing in front of a typewriter. The caption read, 1994, first byline, Times Picayune. The slideshow cycled through 40 photos. My father at restaurants. My father shaking hands with famous chefs. My father at the James Beard Awards. My father holding a pen, looking thoughtful, like he was about to change the world with his words. Photo number 27 was my father standing in front of Maison Vermilion. He was smiling, holding the door open. The caption read, "My favorite restaurant in New Orleans." I glanced at Marcus. His jaw was tight. Photo number 34 was my father holding a framed article. It was the Maison Vermilion review. He was pointing at the headline, grinning. The caption read, "The review I'm most proud of." Marcus stared at the screen. His hands were clenched into fists. The slideshow ended. The lights came back on. There was applause. 45 seconds of clapping, people standing, cheering for my father's 30 years of work. My father walked to the microphone. He smiled. He started his speech. He talked for 4 minutes about food, about what it means to recognize excellence, about the privilege of tasting the work of talented people. Then he said, "For 30 years, I've asked myself, what separates good food from great food? And I've learned that it's not technique. It's not expensive ingredients. It's not Michelin stars or James Beard nominations. It's care. Great food happens when someone cares enough to do it right, even when no one's watching, even when they're tired, even when they could cut corners and no one would know." He paused. He looked out at the audience. I've been privileged to taste the work of people who care that much, and one dish in particular, has defined my final year in this career. Another pause. The étouffée at Maison Vermilion. If you haven't had it, you're missing the best Creole food in this city. Maybe the best I've ever had. Period. I don't know who the saucier is. I've never met them. But whoever they are, they're an artist. And they've reminded me why I fell in love with food in the first place. I looked at Marcus. His eyes were wet. My father kept talking about legacy, about excellence, about the people who make beauty in silence. And then, across the room, the door opened. Chef Antoine Rousseau walked in. Antoine was late. He was wearing a chef's coat, crisp white, perfectly pressed. He walked through the crowd, smiling, shaking hands. My father saw him and his face lit up. He said into the microphone, "Ah, Chef Antoine from Maison Vermilion just arrived. Perfect timing." The room applauded. Antoine waved. He walked toward the stage. My father stepped down and shook Antoine's hand. They talked for a few seconds, too quietly for anyone else to hear. Then my father turned back to the microphone. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Chef Antoine Rousseau, head chef at Maison Vermilion, the restaurant I just mentioned." More applause. My father smiled. He said, "Antoine, since you're here, would you mind if I asked you about that étouffée? I've been raving about it for a year, but I don't actually know who makes it." Antoine laughed. He said, "Of course. I'd love to introduce you to—" He scanned the room. His eyes landed on Marcus. His face lit up. He said, "Marcus, there you are." The room went quiet. My father looked confused. He said, "Marcus?" Antoine pointed at Marcus, smiling, oblivious to the tension. He said, "Raymond, I didn't know Marcus was here. Perfect. Come up, Marcus." Marcus didn't move. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room turn toward us. Antoine kept talking, cheerful and unaware. He said, "Marcus Faison, my lead saucier, the man who makes that étouffée you love so much, Raymond." Complete silence. My father's face went pale. He said, "Marcus Faison?" Antoine nodded. He said, "Yes. Your son-in-law, right? I didn't realize you two knew each other so well." Marcus is brilliant, Raymond. Absolutely brilliant. That sauce. He developed it over 2 years before I even hired him. He's a genius. My father stared at Marcus. Marcus stared back. 11 seconds of silence. Then my father said, his voice barely audible, You made it? Marcus nodded. My father said, The étouffée. The one I... Marcus said, Every time you came in. Yes, sir. I made it. Another 5 seconds of silence. Someone in the crowd, a colleague trying to ease the tension, said, Raymond, this is wonderful. Your son-in-law is the saucier you've been praising. My father didn't respond. He just stood there, holding the microphone, staring at Marcus like the ground had opened up beneath him. And then, he started walking. My father put the microphone down. He stepped off the stage. He walked across the ballroom floor. 47 steps. I counted. The room was silent. Everyone was watching. Marcus stood still. He didn't back away. He didn't move. My father stopped 3 feet in front of him. He looked at Marcus's face. Then he looked down at Marcus's hands. He said quietly, Your hands. I said they were... Marcus said, Too dirty. Yes, sir, I remember. My father's voice cracked. He said, And you made that sauce. For a year. You made it for me. Marcus said, I made it for everyone who ordered it. You just happened to order it 6 times. My father didn't say anything. Marcus said, Why didn't you tell me? My father finally whispered. Marcus said, Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was trying to prove something? My father didn't answer. And then my father did something I never thought I'd see. He reached for Marcus's hand. He didn't shake it. He took it in both of his hands and held it up, studying it. He looked at the calluses on Marcus's palms, the burn scar on his left thumb, 1.5 inches long, pale against the darker skin. The nails, short and clean. The faint smell of lemon. Marcus had scrubbed his hands with lemon juice for 20 minutes before we left the house, trying to get rid of the garlic smell. My father's voice shook. He said, These hands. I said they were too dirty to touch my daughter, and they made the most beautiful thing I've tasted in 30 years. He looked up at Marcus. I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong. Marcus said, Sir, you don't have to. My father said, No, I do. I have to say it. He turned to face the room, still holding Marcus's hand. He raised it so everyone could see. He said, his voice loud enough to carry, These hands made the dish I called transcendent. The dish I said was worth the drive. The dish I told you all to try, and I refused to shake them at his wedding. The room was silent. My father's voice broke. He brought Marcus's hand to his face, and he cried. My father, Raymond DuPont, the most respected food critic in New Orleans, the man who'd spent 30 years critiquing the world, stood in front of 120 people and wept over the hands he'd refused to touch. People started crying too. I saw women dabbing their eyes with napkins. I saw men looking down at their shoes, uncomfortable. My mother was standing 10 feet away. She was staring at my father, her face white. She walked over slowly. She said, Raymond, what are you? My father didn't look at her. He said, Claire, Marcus made the étouffée, the one I've been. My mother said, I know. I heard. She looked at Marcus. Her hands were shaking. She said, You made that? Marcus said, Yes, ma'am. And then my mother's face crumpled. She said, Oh my God. She remembered. I could see it in her face. She'd eaten at Maison Vermilion with my father in December. She'd ordered the étouffée. She'd told my father it was incredible. And a week later, she'd told me that Marcus's hands smelled like grease. She covered her mouth with her hand. She said, I ate it. I told Raymond it was the best thing I'd had in years. And then I I told Beverly that your hands were. She didn't finish the sentence. I said, my voice cold. Too dirty. You said his hands were too dirty to touch me. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She said, I didn't know. I didn't. I said, you didn't ask. You didn't care. You just decided. She stood there, shaking, and I felt nothing. No pity. No forgiveness. Just cold, hard clarity. The party was falling apart. Guests started leaving. Some people came up to Marcus, shaking his hand, congratulating him. Others left quietly, uncomfortable with the raw emotion. Chef Antoine stood off to the side, looking confused but supportive. He put a hand on Marcus's shoulder and said, I had no idea this was. I'm sorry if I caused. Marcus said, It's okay, Chef. You didn't know. Antoine said, For what it's worth, you're the best saucier I've ever worked with. Marcus nodded. He couldn't speak. I grabbed Marcus's hand and pulled him out into the hallway, away from the crowd, away from my parents, away from the mess. I said, You lied to me for a year. He said, I know, I'm sorry. I said, Sorry? You think sorry is enough? You lied to me, Marcus. When I asked if you made that étouffée, you said no. He said, Because I didn't want you to have to choose between me and your father. I said, That wasn't your decision to make. That was my decision. You took that away from me. My voice was rising. I didn't care if people could hear. Marcus said, You're right. I was wrong. I thought I was protecting you. But I was scared. I said, Scared of what? He said, Scared that if I told you, your father would think I was trying to prove something. Or worse. That he'd think the food was only good because he didn't know I made it. Like knowing it was me would ruin it. I softened slightly. I said, You thought I'd tell them? He said, I don't know. I just didn't want to put you in that position. I said, But you did put me in that position. Right now. In front of 120 people. He said, I know. And I'm sorry. I was going to tell you. In August I tried to tell you. But you were busy, and I said, I know. Luke told me. Pause. I said, Were you ever going to tell me, or were you just going to hide it forever? Marcus said, I already resigned. My last day is October 31st. I was going to tell you after the party, when things were less complicated. I stared at him. I said, Nothing is ever less complicated, Marcus. Life is complicated, and you need to trust me to handle it. He nodded. He looked down. He said, You're right. We stood there in the hallway for a long time, not speaking. Finally, I said, I need time. He said, I understand. I said, But I'm not leaving you. I just need time to figure out how to trust you again. He said, Okay. We walked back into the ballroom. My father was still there, surrounded by guests, looking lost. I walked to the microphone. I didn't ask permission. I just picked it up and tapped it. The room went quiet. People turned to look at me. I said, Sorry to interrupt. I'm Beverly Faison, Raymond's daughter. Pause. Some of you know me, some of you don't. Some of you were told I was too busy with work to come tonight. That's a lie. The truth is, my mother didn't want me to come because she thought my husband would embarrass my father. People shifted uncomfortably. I kept going. Marcus, my husband, is a line cook. My family thought that meant he was beneath us. For 5 years, my father refused to shake his hand. My mother said his hands were too dirty. And for 1 year, Marcus made the dish my father called the best thing I've ever tasted. The irony isn't lost on me, and I hope it's not lost on any of you. I looked at my father. Dad, you spent 30 years writing about food, about excellence, about people who care, but you missed it when it was standing right in front of you. Not because you weren't smart enough, but because you didn't want to see it. My father was listening. He didn't interrupt. I said, I don't know where we go from here. I don't know if I can forgive this. But I know one thing. If you want a relationship with me, with us, you need to do more than apologize in this room. You need to change, publicly. And you need to start by telling the truth about who made the dish you love. I put the microphone down. My hands were shaking, but my voice had been steady. My father looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. He walked to the microphone. He said, Beverly's right, about all of it. He looked out at the room. I was wrong. Not just about Marcus, about the way I judge people, about the way I let my ego blind me to excellence. Marcus Faison made the dish I praised, and I refused to shake his hand at his wedding. That's not just hypocrisy. It's cruelty. And I'm ashamed. He looked at Marcus. Marcus, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know. I'm going to spend the rest of my retirement trying to make this right. I'm going to write an article. Not a review, but a correction. I'm going to tell everyone who made that étouffée. And I'm going to explain why I was wrong about you. Marcus said, Sir, you don't need to. My father said, I do. Not for you. For me. The room was silent. Then slowly people started clapping. 55 people. Not everyone. But enough. 2 months later, in December of 2024, New Orleans Magazine published an article written by my father. The headline was, The Hands I Refused to Shake, A Critic's Reckoning. It was 2,400 words long. The magazine made it the cover story. I read it at home, sitting on the couch with Marcus. My father wrote, In October, I reviewed an étouffée I called Transcendent. I said the saucier was a master. I was right. What I didn't know was that the saucier was my son-in-law, a man I'd refused to acknowledge for 5 years because I believed his profession was beneath my family. I was wrong. Spectacularly, shamefully wrong. Marcus Faison is not just a line cook, he is an artist. And the dish I praised, the dish I said was worth the drive, was made by hands I once called too dirty to touch my daughter. This is not a review. This is an apology. To Marcus, to my daughter Beverly, and to every cook, every dishwasher, every person in a kitchen who has been made to feel lesser because their work involves sweat and heat and oil. You are not beneath anyone. You are the foundation of everything I've spent 30 years writing about. And I'm sorry I forgot that. When I finished reading, I started crying. Marcus said, He actually did it. I said, Yeah, he did. We set boundaries with my family. I told my parents, We'll attend family dinners, but if anyone disrespects Marcus, we leave. No second chances. I told my mother, You need therapy, not because we're forcing you, but because you need to confront why you judge people the way you do. I told my father, You need action, not just words. Prove you've changed. They agreed. In January of 2025, we had our first family dinner in 5 years. It was at my parents' house. It was awkward. But it was civil. My mother had started therapy. She'd been to 2 sessions. My father asked Marcus about his work. It was the first time he'd ever asked. He said, Marcus, are you still at Maison Vermilion? Marcus said, No, I quit in October. I'm a private chef now. My father said, Private chef? For who? Marcus said, For people who want homemade quality food, small dinners, intimate events. My father said, That sounds perfect for you. It wasn't much, but it was something. In March of 2025, 6 months after the party, Chef Antoine invited my father and Marcus to Maison Vermilion after hours. He said, "Raymond, you praised this kitchen for a year. Maybe it's time you actually saw how it works." We went at 10 p.m. after the restaurant closed. It was just Antoine, my father, Marcus, and me. Marcus put on a borrowed chef's coat. My father put on an apron. It was the first time in his life he'd ever worn one. Marcus said, "Okay. First step, the roux. You need equal parts flour and oil." My father said, "How much?" Marcus said, "3/4 of a cup of each, but first, you need to feel the pan." He guided my father's hand to the cast iron skillet. "Do you feel the heat?" My father said, "Yeah, it's hot." Marcus said, "Not just hot. It needs to be the right temperature. If it's too hot, the roux will burn. If it's too cold, it won't develop color." For 47 minutes, my father stood over that pan, stirring. His arm got sore. He said, "How do you do this every day?" Marcus said, "Practice and love." When the roux reached the perfect mahogany color, Marcus said, "There, you see that? That's the color we need." My father stared into the pot. He said, "It's beautiful." Marcus said, "That's the foundation. Everything else builds on this." 2 hours later, the étouffée was done. Marcus plated 4 portions. We sat at the prep table and we ate. My father tasted the sauce he'd helped make. He said, "This is different." Marcus said, "Different how?" My father said, "It's not as good as yours." Marcus laughed. He said, "That's because it's your first time making it. I made it 69 times before I got it right." My father said, "But it's still good. I made this." I said, "Yeah, Dad, you did." My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I understand now. Why you love this work." Marcus said, "Why?" My father said, "Because when you make something really good, you've created something from nothing. You've given someone joy. You've made them feel loved." Pause. He said, "I wrote about that for 30 years, but I never felt it until now." 6 months after my father's retirement party, I sat in a kitchen with the 2 men I loved most, my husband and my father, and watched them laugh over a pot of étouffée. It wasn't perfect. My mother was still learning how to see people instead of status. Marcus and I were still rebuilding trust after a year of lies. My father still flinched sometimes when he thought about what he'd done, but we were here, together. And that was something. Some things break, some things heal, and some things, the best things, become stronger in the places they were broken. This was one of those things. My name is Beverly Faison. I'm 27 years old, and I'm the daughter of a food critic and the wife of a line cook. And I wouldn't change a single thing.